Yes.
Ja hoor.
Slaan we uit?
Nee, maar nu wel. Lekker man. Alright. This feels very YouTube. Starting with the clap. How do YouTubers do that? Welcome everyone to this very first YouTube video. My name is Salim, whatever you want to call me. I'll put my name in text on the screen right now. 21 years old. I'm actually still a student working on my thesis. I've been working on my thesis for 20,000 years now, so that's nice. And one other thing about me is that I'm a filmmaker. I'm a photographer and a filmmaker, actually. I've been doing that for the last couple of years. I just really like doing it, and I've worked on multiple projects, projects for close friends, projects for companies, and it's been really great. But today I wanted to talk about the 3 main principles of photography. And what I mean by that is basically the 3 main settings that you use to get yourself out of auto mode. A lot of people, when they start doing photography or shooting videos or anything, they're very much stuck on auto mode just because when they put it to manual mode, they feel like the image just looks worse than what they would have on auto mode, which obviously makes a lot of sense. You know, if you're used to auto mode and just used to picking up your camera and just shooting images or just hitting record and let the camera do everything, obviously, you know, manual is gonna look worse to you at first, but using manual settings can be so much better. You know, I want to talk about the 3 main settings, which are in order: the ISO, the aperture, and the shutter speed. And under those 3, I want to talk about like little mini subjects that will come back in each one of them. Now, all 3 of these settings, the ISO, aperture, and shutter speed, affect exposure in a way. All 3 of them have a direct effect on how the image is exposed. So if it's really blown out or if it's really underexposed. And what I want to talk about of these 3 settings is, first of all, obviously how they are measured, in what number, what they do, how they affect the exposure, what the drawback is of each of these settings, because all 3 of them basically can make your picture more exposed but with a drawback, and the creative way to use that drawback. All 3 of these also have a nice creative way that you can almost like misuse them to make a creative look. So the first one on the list is ISO. And ISO is basically the easiest one, and that's why I wanted to start with it, because it's just measured in numbers. And it starts usually around 100 or 200 depending on your camera. And it goes up to like 8,000, 10,000, and it can go even higher than that. And basically what ISO does, it's artificially lighting up your picture, which means the higher your ISO, the more exposed your picture is going to be. So if you're looking at your image and you're like, it's a little underexposed, you can just up your ISO and it will get lighter. Now you're probably thinking, that sounds too good to be true. And why would I ever buy an expensive lens or an expensive camera body if I can just up the ISO and make my picture exposed perfectly every time with each camera? And you'd be right, except there's one drawback. Like I said before, each of these settings has a drawback. And the drawback of the ISO is quite obvious. It just adds grain to your picture. So what that means is when you look at a picture that was taken with a super high ISO and you zoom in on it, you can see little particles of grain, which kind of looks bad and cheap. So the more basic your camera body is, the quicker you will see grain when you up the ISO. And obviously that's a little bit overgeneralized. You know, there's a lot of more expensive bodies that can also show grain pretty quickly and vice versa. But that's just a general rule of thumb. It actually has to do with the sensor size. If you don't know what that is, I highly recommend looking that up on YouTube. There's amazing explanations on it. So ISO, the higher, the more exposed, but also the more grain. Obviously, grain can also be used in a creative way, and that is to create a vintage look. Basically, if you have a very high ISO, that grainy feel, that grainy look is going to give a little bit of a vintage vibe to your picture. Now, before you start doing that, it isn't really done in camera anymore nowadays, because if you have a high ISO while recording or while taking a picture, you're always going to have grain, which kind of limits you in your options in, say, like Lightroom or another software. So what a lot of people will do is they'll just use a low ISO and then just add grain in the editing software later, which just gives you a little bit more freedom. But if you don't have an expensive editing software, or if you just don't have a very expensive camera and you still want to be able to expose your picture great, and you know for a fact that after you've taken a picture you want a grainy look, pumping up your ISO can really help. Alright, that brings us to the next setting, which is the aperture. And whereas ISO is very based on your camera's body, the aperture is almost completely based on the quality and the expense of the lens that you have on your body. First of all, aperture is measured in f-stops, and you can usually see this when you're buying a lens. It will say the millimeters, so like the focal distance of the lens, but it will also say like f 1.8 or f2.8 or f4.0. And this is how aperture is measured. And it's actually quite simple. The lower the f-stop, the more light is going to come in, the more exposed your picture is going to be. The lower the f-stop, the more open the lens can be, which kind of like means more light coming into the lens. So basically, if you have a very, very narrow hole and you're trying to pour water in it, it's kind of hard. But if you have a very, very big open hole like a glass or a big vase and you're trying to pour water in that, it's a lot easier. The lower the f-stop, the more open the lens, the more light can hit the sensor, the more exposed your picture is. Now again, just like with ISO, I hear you, okay, I'll just buy a cheap body and I'll just buy a little bit more of an expensive lens and you're just gonna get perfect exposure all the time. Well, obviously, just like with ISO, f-stop also has a drawback. The drawback of the Aperture is going to be a little bit less obvious because the drawback has been used so many times to create a creative effect that it's almost become the standard. And that is bokeh. If you don't know what bokeh is, I'll put some example pictures on the screen right now, but it basically just means that the background behind the subject is very, very blurry, which makes the subject pop out. And that is actually the drawback of a low aperture. Because if you have a very, very low f-stop, it means that your plane of focus is very small, very narrow. Theoretically, if you had like an f0.2 lens pointing on me right now, it would mean that the distance between my nose and my eyes, you know, like my nose is a little bit closer to the camera than my eyes are because my face has a little bit of depth in it. It would either mean that my nose would be in focus or my eyes would be in focus. It can't be my entire face. But you know, this small, narrow plane of focus can sometimes be a drawback. For example, when you're shooting a video like I am right now and I'm moving my head a little bit forward and backward the entire time, you either need a good autofocus to keep following me and always keep my face into focus, or you'd want to crank up your f-stop a little bit higher so that that plane of focus becomes a little bit broader and my entire face can be in focus instead of just like my nose or my eyes. Okay, we're almost there, bear with me. Last but not least, it's shutter speed. And shutter speed is actually the most simple or the most logical setting on a camera. Whenever you're taking a picture on your camera, there's a shutter in front of it that opens up and then closes again. It shuts. And what that does, it allows light to hit your sensor. So light is not constantly hitting your sensor. When you take a picture, it's opening up, letting a little bit of light in, and then closing again. The period in which the sensor is exposed to light, that's what the shutter speed is. Shutter speed is measured in seconds, or in most cases, fractions of seconds. For example, 1/500, which is 1/500th of a second. A lot of camera manufacturers, for example, Canon, won't even show you 1/500 because the fractions are a lot more commonly to use than using something over 1 second. So what makes shutter speed a little bit more complicated, like I said, is that a lot of manufacturers don't use 1/500 or 1/250. They'll just show 500 or 250. But the thing is that if you crank up the number and it gets higher, your picture would get darker because we're actually talking about fractions here. And 1/500, as you know, is 1/500th of a second, which is obviously a lot quicker than, for example, 1/250 or 1/50 or 1/20 or 1/10. You know, those are all becoming slower and slower shutter speeds. Meaning that you want your shutter speed to be as long as possible if you want your picture to be really exposed. But obviously this also has a drawback because, you know, you can't make your shutter speed be forever, right? You can't put your shutter speed on like 5 minutes. That would mean that when you press the button to take a picture, it's gonna take 5 minutes to let all the light in and then the shutter is gonna close. So this is not gonna work, right? So you want it to be faster. We get that, but there's some more subtle nuanced drawbacks to it. Because, for example, if you're taking pictures at a soccer game or at an American football game or any sports game where there's a lot of movement and people moving around quickly, jumping, sliding, whatever, you don't want a shutter speed that is any slower than, say, like half a second. Because if someone's moving and they're running for like, I don't know how fast, and you're taking a picture of them and it's taking your camera a half a second to process it, the person is moving all the while you're taking a picture. And that brings us to the drawback. blurry images. So I'll put some examples on the screen of blurry images. In Dutch we say the picture is moved when this happens. It's because it looks like someone is moving in the picture. So to recap, shutter speed, the faster the shutter speed, the darker your picture is going to be, but it's going to be easier to take sharp pictures of fast moving objects. But the slower the shutter speed, the more light is going to hit the sensor, which makes your picture better exposed. But the problem is that you need to photograph something that isn't moving too fast. The faster something moves, the faster your shutter speed needs to be to catch up. So shutter speed obviously has a drawback, but that drawback has been used to also create awesome effects. And these effects can be achieved by using a slow shutter speed. So that means the shutter opens for a long time, making a lot of light hit the sensor. The way you can use this drawback in a creative way is when you're filming something that is both still and moving. For example, a waterfall. It's in one place, but it is a continuous motion. And when you then use a long exposure, what's going to happen is that moving water is going to be one big blurry line, which kind of creates the illusion of a video almost. It kind of creates this idea that the water is falling. You sort of like captured motion in a picture. So just a quick recap here of all the three settings. We have ISO, aperture, and shutter speed. ISO, the higher the number, the better your picture is going to be exposed, but also the more grain is going to be added. But this grain can be used to create a vintage effect. Then aperture, measured in f-stops, the lower the number, the more open your lens is going to be, the better exposure or the more exposure you're going to get onto your picture, but it also creates a narrower and narrower panel of focus, which means that if it's very low, you can only move an inch forward or backward or you will be out of focus. But this narrow plane of focus can be used to make subjects pop from the background because the background will be blurry and they'll be in focus. And last but not least, shutter speed. The quicker the shutter speed, the less light is going to come in, but you can take sharp pictures of very fast moving objects. But the longer the shutter speed, the more exposure is going to come in, but fast moving objects become blurry. But this longer shutter speed can also be used to capture motion in your picture, like for example a waterfall or a bunch of cars driving by in a city. All in all three settings are wonderful. There's no right, there's no wrong. You know, like I said, all three settings have a drawback that has been used creatively. It's almost like all three of them have a rule, like don't have a high ISO, don't have a too long shutter speed because you're going to get blurry images, don't have a too low aperture because you don't want stuff to be out of focus. But again, all three of them have been used in a beautiful way, both done by the rules but also by breaking the rules and creating new effects and creating awesome images. So, you know, good luck shooting out there. I hope you will turn that wheel up there from that A to that M and start shooting manual, and I'll see you guys in the next video.